Recording in progress.
Okay, it's recorded now.
Yeah. Let's stop the. But I believe there was supposed to be some sort of launching video.
So yeah.
Okay.
So we all present first, right? And then towards the end, that will be the Q&A.
Apparently that's, I mean, we can also change the organization. I'm happy with allocating 20 minutes per paper and letting presenters decide how to handle the answers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's better to have the Q&A at the end, right?
Fine. Then let's go with that. It would be nice to have Sola with us.
I don't know.
He doesn't seem to be here.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, worst case, it will be a shorter session. Having lots of time for questions.
Yeah, wait. Because you were the one who sent the email, right? And then Andrea.
Yes. Yeah, because I actually realized suddenly that I don't have it, which is very bad of me. But...
Yeah. Okay. But it should be morning for him, right? Or I don't know if he's a she or a she.
I have no clue. But now the session is starting soon. Well.
Yeah, in 3 minutes.
Hi, Maya. Hi, Victor.
Hello.
Hi, good afternoon. From here, I know it's evening.
Oh, that's Sola. Yes. Hi.
Yeah, good afternoon. Victor, where are you joining from?
From Lisbon.
From Lisbon. Okay, I think we are almost around the same time zone. I'm in Abuja, in Nigeria.
Nice, nice.
Okay, nice to meet you.
All right, so we're all here. Mr. Sola Omoju, can you please test to share the screen? If you
I can't hear you, please.
Share.
Can you share your screen, please, so we can...
You want me to share my screen?
Yes. I mean, if you have slides to share for the presentation, it's just to check.
Okay, all right, let me do that quickly. Okay. Sharing my screen right now. Share my screen. So can you see my screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Maybe if you can make it full screen, because now we see the whole PowerPoint layout.
Okay, is it better now?
Yes, beautiful.
Okay, great.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Okay, we will start in 1 minute. So be prepared. Thank you.
It's very, very well organized, I have to say, compared to all the presentation I may have done online. It seems like there's a very serious back office. And Sola, do I present your name like Sola, or is there...
Sola is perfect. It's okay, right?
Okay, okay, perfect. So Maha and Sola.
Yes.
Yeah, you're correct.
So at least that I get right.
So Maha is presenting first, I guess?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, like how
Yes.
many minutes do we have? Because I can see the whole session is 1 hour. How many minutes do we have for the presentation?
About 15?
I think it would be nice, yes, to have 15 minutes. And then Andrea and Maha were suggesting to keep all the questions for the end. All questions have to be written in the chat. There's no oral question. So it would be either me reading them for Maha and you, Sola, or you, Sola, if you
So,
chair my session, to read it to me.
Excuse me,
okay,
ladies and
so
gentlemen. We're gonna start the countdown right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Renewable Energy and Natural Resources session. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mrs. Victoria Girard, to open the session. Mrs. Victoria Girard, the screen.
Many thanks to all of you to attend this session today. We have three presentations, and we'll start with Maha presenting on extreme weather events and household welfare, followed by Sola on macroeconomic impacts of fiscal incentives for renewable energy before my own presentation. Please write down all your questions in the chat and we will read them out loud at the end of the session for each of the presenters. Maha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Do you see it? Let me just, okay. Okay, hold on. Okay, good evening, everyone, or good day, wherever you may be. First of all, many thanks to the International Economic Association for the opportunity to share our research with you today. I've been really looking forward to go to Bali and meet everyone, but nonetheless, I'm just as glad to be here and participate in this online conference. This is a collaborative effort, this research, with colleagues from the Department of Economics at Ateneo de Manila University and the Manila Observatory, whose names you see on the screen. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project that is funded by IDRC Canada. So the title of our research is Extreme Weather Events and Households Welfare in the Formal and Informal Sector. So just to give a context, situated in the tropics and the Pacific, the Philippines is vulnerable to extreme weather events such as super typhoons, storm surges, intense flooding, among others. The World Risk Report has consistently ranked the Philippines as third among the top 15 most exposed countries in the world, next to Vanuatu and Tonga. In 2019 to 2020, the country registered an improvement, ranking number 9. Now, extreme events are just natural hazards. However, they are elevated into a disaster when they overwhelm human capacity, create destruction and damage, and cost human lives. Disaster caused by natural hazards have become a pressing development concern because they can negate development gains, they can push any household into poverty, and exacerbate inequality. Now, why are we interested in knowing the impact of these disasters between the formal and informal sector? The literature defined formal sector to be those that are subject to taxation and regulatory law, while the informal sector is largely outside of it, making it implicitly illegal. However, there is not a sharp divide between the formal and informal sector. Nonetheless, a differentiation is useful as this can serve as a guide in the improvements of statistical databases and formulation and implementation of policies. We also note that informality aggravates the socioeconomic cost incurred by households during disasters. They don't have access to health insurance. They have lack of access to formal financial instruments to cope with risk. Thus, disaster can increase the vulnerability of informal households to remain informal while also increasing the risk that formal households will fall into informality. Now, with climatic changes that are expected to result in shifting precipitation patterns and potentially but slightly stronger cyclones affecting the country, understanding the impact of extreme weather events on the welfare of the formal and informal sectors is crucial for the appropriate design of policy instrument and social protection. Now, we take the number of extreme rainfall days as a proxy for these extreme weather events. So our objective is to assess and differentiate the impact of extreme rainfall days on the welfare of the formal and informal sectors of the economy using household survey data. Specifically, we will be using the Family Income and Expenditure Survey and the Labor Force Survey, which is a nationally representative data that is conducted by the Philippine Statistics Authority. Okay, so to define the number of extreme rainfall day, we utilized a satellite-derived daily rainfall from the Tropical Rainfall Measuring Mission multi-satellite precipitation analysis dataset from 1998 to 2018, so over 2 decades. Its spatial coverage is about 25-kilometer grid resolution, which addresses the constraint posed by the limited number of weather stations in the Philippines. So in a day, we define it to be an extreme rainfall day if the rainfall registered for that day exceeds the 95th percentile of daily rainfall over the 2 decade period. So here is a picture of that. Now, each year, we distinguish municipalities, okay, as areas experiencing normal or extreme rainfall. A municipality is tagged under extreme when the number of extreme rainfall days for the year exceeds the 75th percentile of the annual number of extreme rainfall days across the 2 decade period. So here is a map of the extreme areas experiencing extreme rainfall for 2005, 2008, 2011, and 2014. These are a previous year's mapping with the data that we will be using for the household survey because we note that the impact of this disaster is captured by the data the following year. Now, who are the households in the formal and informal sector in the Philippines? We also note that the Philippine Statistics Authority does not issue official statistical counts of formal and informal households in the country. However, it defines the informal sector as those households unincorporated enterprises. So we use this definition as a basis in identifying households in the informal sector using the labor force survey. So from 2006 to 2015, we note that the share of the informal households decreased from 43% to 36%. But for these 2 years, 2006 to 29, the proportion of informal households is higher, and then we see a reversal in 2012 and 2015. Now, informal households are also mostly in the rural areas, and most of them are poor. A household is considered poor if its total income is less than the provincial poverty threshold set by the government. So this table highlights the intersection of the informality and poverty in the Philippines. So since we are comparing the welfare of the households in the formal and informal sector, just a simple t-test provide a striking results. So we see here that the income and per capita expenditure of informal households are lower than the formal, but they are much lower when the informal households are living or are in the areas that are experiencing extreme rainfall. And the difference are all significant. So now we go to the formal examination of the difference or of the impact of these extreme rainfall days on the welfare of the formal and informal households. Now, the simplest approach is to just do OLS and then include a dummy variable, whether the household is formal or informal. However, doing OLS leads to a biased estimate due to the assumption that informality is exogenously determined when in fact it can be potentially endogenous. Households belonging to informal sector may have systematically different characteristics and choose to be in the informal sector due to its expected benefits. They are thereby also influencing their income. So to address this endogeneity and selectivity bias, we estimate a switching regression model by using maximum likelihood methods. So a household faces a choice between informal and informal sector. Then the difference in the net benefits determine the sector of choice. So this is governed by the system of equation having two welfare equation, one for the informal and the other one is for the formal. And then this is the selection equation. The Y here would be either the per capita income or per capita expenditure. The D stands for the disaster, which in our case is the number of extreme rainfall days, lag up to 3 years. The X is just the vector of households characteristics. Z include the X and other identifying variable for this selection equation. Now, we do not observe this decision-making variable of the household, but the observed value outcome of this I star is given by 1 if I star is positive and 0 otherwise. So the excess or the vector of household characteristics include sex, age, square of age, marital status, educational attainment of the household head, as well as household size. And then the sector selection variable, this is the Z, includes the urban and rural municipality being poor or non-poor and the household characteristics. So we pulled our data for 4 years and implemented both OLS also and the switching regression using the move state command in Zeta. So let me give you the full result. This is the OLS. So we use real per capita expenditure and real per capita income as the outcome variable. This is the selection equation and this is the welfare equation. Let me magnify this table so that we can all see. First, the result of the OLS estimate. It shows that households have lower income and expenditure given by the negative coefficient. Being informal relative to formal sector decreases expenditure and income by around 7%, holding other things constant. But we know that this is biased because it assumes that informality is exogenous. Now, going to the switching regression results. So we have here the selection equation. This gives us the answer to the question, what factors influence household to be informal? Now, being poor significantly affects the likelihood that households will be informal. And being considered as urban inversely affects the likelihood that households will be informal. And then going to the results of the full information maximum likelihood on the welfare, the estimates show that extreme rainfall adversely affects welfare, here using expenditure as our outcome variable. Extreme rainfall days significantly lowers expenditure of households in the formal and informal sector by 16.2% and 10.6% respectively. Using income as welfare indicator, the negative effects is slightly bigger at 17.2 and 11.9% for the informal households. Now, note that we lag our disaster variable or the extreme number of rainfall days up to 3 years. We note that here, the coefficient are all negative and significant, with the magnitude getting smaller the earlier the experience of extreme rainfall. Now, this results is striking as we will graph it. Here we have the dotted line representing the effect on the formal sector for the 3-year and the solid line for the informal sector. The dotted line is more negative, indicating that the impact on the formal sector is much higher, and then the slope of this line can be interpreted as the speed of recovery, so that we know that the formal sector recovers faster than the informal sector. Now, what is the takeaway from these results? Households in the formal sector has larger income and therefore has more to lose than the households in the informal sector. However, the adverse impact to the informal households may be irreversible given their weak capability to recover and their limited ability to smooth out consumption even during days with normal rainfall. Now, further differentiating the impact of these extreme rainfall days on the welfare of the informal and formal households. One might,
Just to be sure, you have 1 minute left.
yes, this is my second
Thank
to the
you.
last slide. Thank you. One might compare the welfare of these informal households that actually did go to the informal sector and the income of the or expenditure of the formal households that did go to the formal sector. But that comparison might be misleading. The proper comparison should be these cells A and C, which is the actual versus the counterfactual. So households who are in the informal sector have income lower by 1,109 compared to a counterfactual case had they chose the formal sector. And similarly, cells B and D, where the counterfactual of formal household is had they chosen the informal sector. So as a concluding remarks, households, regardless of which sector they belong, reels from the negative effects of experiencing extreme rainfall from 3 years ago up to a year ago. Weak capability to recover and the limited ability to smooth out consumption even during days with normal rainfall makes extreme weather events adversely potent for the welfare of the informal households. Targeted social protection coverage to households near the poverty line can help soften the blow of a weather shocks. This includes improving the informal sector access to opportunities for smoothing consumption and awareness or education campaign regarding the impact of disasters. Thank you very much, and I look forward to receiving your comments and suggestions at the end. Thank you. Victor?
Many thanks, Maha, for this presentation and great timing. I guess, so please do write at any point, any question in the chat, and we'll take them towards the end. And we now have Sola, who's taking the floor.
All right, thank you. My name is Shola. I'm from Nigeria. I'm based in Abuja. And in the next 10, 15 minutes, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. All right, in the next 10, 15 minutes, I'll be presenting the result of our research, macroeconomic impact of fiscal incentive for renewable energy, evidence from Nigeria. This research is a collaboration between myself, Emily Kide, Stephen, and Augustina, and the research was funded by the Partnership for Economic Policy. This is just the content. Yeah, Nigeria has one of the lowest electrification rates among energy producing countries. According to the International Energy Agency, about 74 million Nigerians do not have access to electricity, and this is disproportionate when you look at rural households. Like only 34% of rural households have access to electricity compared to 86% of urban households. Also, as a result of this, about 58% of electricity used in Nigeria is from petrol and diesel generators. Because people do not have access to electricity from the utility, they tend to generate their own electricity using petrol and diesel generator. So when we look at the current structure of the energy structure, we see that 83% of electricity generation capacity is from fossil fuel, while hydro account for 98% of total renewable energy. Of course, as a result of that, we can see that energy-related CO2 emission has increased from 69.9 million metric tons in 1980 to 97.1 million metric tons in 2016. Okay, as part of effort to improve electricity and reduce CO2 emission, the Nigerian government enacted the National Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Policy in 2015. One of the objectives of the policy is to achieve 20% share of renewable energy in total electricity generation by 2030. And there are several measures, incentives that the government aim to use to achieve this goal. And one of them is production tax. And according to this study by Emodi and Ebele, they show that in the case of Nigeria, production tax is more practically and administratively feasible among all the other incentives. So in terms of the statement of research problem, we all agree that renewable energy policies are aimed at addressing environmental problem, climate change, but they also have economic implications. So there are several studies that look at the economic impact of renewable energy policies. There are a lot of studies right there. But to the best of our knowledge, there's no study that has empirically examined the effectiveness and impact of this Nigerian policy. Of course, available studies in the literature also, particularly studies that focus on developing countries, they do not always take into consideration the high proportion of self-generated electricity. That is the large proportion of electricity generated by people individually. So this, it is, at least to the best of our knowledge, our study is the first that incorporates self-generation into the modeling process. So we model this energy system in a CG framework, following the works of G and Lay 2007, and Wainwright and Asafo Ajayi 2013. So our broad research question is for us to understand the impact of production incentive for renewable energy sector. We have three specific objectives: to examine the effects of production subsidy in boosting renewable energy sector, to understand the macroeconomic impacts of this type of subsidy, and to determine whether the effectiveness and impact of this subsidy depends on how the subsidy is financed. So for this study, we are using the computable general equilibrium model. And specifically, we are using the standard PEP11 model developed by Decaloe. One of the major innovation or addition we made to this model was we try as much as possible to make adjustment to the model. For example, in the standard model, electricity is not, or energy is not included as a factor of production. But we all know that in the production process, electricity or energy is an important factor. So we incorporate electricity as a factor of production. That is why if you look at the figure on the schematic presentation of the model, we can see that for the economy to produce, you have value added and electricity and intermediate consumption. So your value added and electricity can also consist of capital and electricity composites and labor. And your capital electricity composite can also be disaggregated into your capital and electricity. So one of the major innovation of this work was to now disaggregate the electricity supply in the system to what people generate themselves and what they get from the utility. And the electricity they get from the utility is further disaggregated into fossil fuel and renewable electricity. And the equations depicting that is presented in the slide. So we use the social accounting data to calibrate the model. I think the available social accounting data for Nigeria was built in 2010 based on 2006 data. And the SAM contains 61 sectors, 62 commodities, 3 production factors, 4 agents, and 12 household categories. But considering this period when the SAM was built and now, I think we agree that the Nigerian economy has changed significantly in terms of the size and the structure. So we use the cross-entropy method developed by Lemelin to update the SAM from 2006 to 2013. So after updating the SAM and making all the modifications, we have, at the end of the day, we have 25 sectors and 26 commodities. And we also use data from the World Bank and the Central Bank of Nigeria to disaggregate the SAM further. The elasticities we use for our analysis is based on the work of Decaloe, the work of Chi, and the emission coefficients are obtained from the work of Mu et al. Let me go to the result. Yeah, in terms of the result, I think the first thing I want to present is to actually see the effectiveness of this production subsidy for increasing renewable electricity. And we have 2 scenarios. The first scenario is that this subsidy is financed by its fiscal deficit. That means government borrowing. And secondly, the second scenario, scenario B, is that this subsidy is financed by government adjusting its expenditure so that it doesn't necessarily have to borrow to accommodate this subsidy. So what we found out is that providing subsidy for the renewable electricity sector actually increased the use of renewable in most of the sector. You can see, I think, some of the sector in the agriculture sector, in the manufacturing sector, and even in the services sector. In most of the sector, the use of renewable energy increases. And why did that happen? Subsidy reduces the cost of production, and that cost of production reduces the price of renewable electricity. However, we find out that despite the fact that the consumption of renewable electricity increases, it doesn't necessarily reduce the consumption of fossil fuel and self-generated electricity. So that gives us an idea that production subsidy can increase the use of renewable energy, but it may not necessarily reduce or it may not necessarily substitute fossil fuel electricity. In terms of the macroeconomic impact, we can see that government providing subsidy for renewable energy sector in Nigeria reduces government revenue from production tax. As we can see under the two scenarios, for example, under scenario A, we can see government revenue from production tax reduces by 34%, while under scenario B, it reduces by 43%. We also see that government expenditure on goods and services reduce, while government savings increases. Unemployment reduce, nominal GDP, nominal and real GDP increases. And we see that under the scenario A, a very important observation is, although CO2 emission reduced, but it did not reduce as much as we have under scenario B. So from what we can see in terms of the macroeconomic impact of this type of renewable energy fiscal subsidy, we find out that subsidizing this renewable energy by adjusting government expenditure to accommodate the subsidy can have worse macroeconomic impacts than when governments address this subsidy by fiscal deficit. Also, we also try to look at the potential impact of this subsidy on household welfare. And what we can see is in terms of the scenario A, where this subsidy is financed by deficit, we find out that household income, or in fact, all categories of household income increases, while under the scenario B, household income reduces. And when we look at the household welfare effect, which is actually presented by the real household consumption budget, we find that the household welfare will increase by 0.44%, while under scenario B, it will reduce by 0.92%. So in terms of comparing the two scenarios, in terms of how government should finance the subsidy, we find out that scenario A has much positive impact on household welfare, while scenario B has mostly negative impact. So in terms of the policy implication, the summary of the results shows that production tax incentive or subsidy may be effective in promoting renewable energy use in Nigeria, but it may not be sufficient to substitute fossil fuel. And the main idea of climate change mitigation is when you are increasing your use of renewable energy, you're supposed to reduce your use of fossil fuel. We'll find out that that might not be the case in the, using this situation. Also, we found out the macroeconomic impact depends on how the subsidy is financed. When the subsidy is financed through fiscal deficit, it has positive effects on GDP and household welfare. But if the subsidy is financed by adjusting government expenditure, economic growth, household welfare decreases. But this has a higher effect on reducing CO2 emission. And the mixed effect of this policy on key macroeconomic variables should be taken into consideration, and any negative effect, particularly on the economy, should be mitigated. Also, we recommend that optimal level of financing should be determined to ensure a strong balance between energy, economic, and environmental objectives. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and observations.
Many thanks, Sola, for this presentation. In case anyone has joined the session in between, please feel free to write your question in the chat. We'll read them at the end of the session. Let me now quickly present my own work and apply like this. Wait. How do I manage to make it nice like that? Okay. And yeah, okay. So, well, it's a pleasure to be virtually here today to present you this joint work with Nicolas Berman and Mathieu Coutenier on how the exploitation of natural resources may actually trigger a change in the salience of ethnic group identities. Why did we start working on this? Well, there's a big debate on how non-renewable natural resources shape development, both as input as in terms of outcomes. So here we're really in a different form of natural resources than what we've seen in the two previous presentation, because we're looking at mineral resources, okay, like industrial mines. And there's this large debate on what is the role of these mineral resources in development processes. And in parallel, there's increasing knowledge that identity, and in particular, whether these identities are fragmented rather than cohesive, is also a key determinant of socioeconomic and political outcomes. And on top of that, we know that these identities, and those identities are more or less fragmented, varies across space and varies across time. So we put these two observations together and basically ask, does resource exploitation foster identification to ethnic groups rather than nation? And we asked this question in the setting of sub-Saharan Africa, where two specificities of mineral resources makes them really relevant for ethnic group identities. The first is the fact that mineral resources necessarily are point source resources. They lie within specific location, which in the context of sub-Saharan African countries will be associated with historical ethnic homelands. The boundaries of these historical ethnic homelands may have varied a bit across time, but we know that they're still prevalent in many countries still today, despite the building of national states. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that natural resources trigger debates about the perceived ownership of the resources, who's the legitimate beneficiary of the rent arising from the resources. Unlike goods or services which need to be produced, you really have rents arising from the resources. And then who should have them? Should it be the nationals of the state where the resource is being extracted? Should it be the locals who reside around this resource or who come from the historical ethnic homeland where this resource is located? Or should it be those who discover or exploit the resource? And this debate on perceived ownership may escalate up to secession attempts or the emergence of secessionist parties. And that's really the two groups we focus on as this two last group of the national state with the resources versus the local historical inhabitant of the region. Okay. There's two potential mechanisms through which we expect that we may see a relation between the exploitation of the mineral resources and the salience of ethnic group identification, which the first one, which we will actually think is a relevant one in this setting, is about feelings of economic deprivation and political exclusion if payoffs fall short of expectation. I want to insist here that it's not necessarily that there's no economic payoff. We remain quite agnostic about that, but it's the idea that you have a discrepancy between the payoff you expect and the payoff that you get. And that is what creates this feeling of economic deprivation. The feelings may be potentially exacerbated in case of group persecution of conflicts or in the presence of, let's call them ethnic political entrepreneurs, leaders, be it at the local or the national level, that have an interest to capitalize above these group level feelings of grievances. The main competing explanation of the effect that we observe would be that natural resources may trigger direct economic gains or access to political power, and this increases the payoff, the perceived interest of being a member of a given ethnic group. But this explanation is not consistent with a variety of results that we obtain. Let me go into a bit more detail of how we do that. So we combine 3 types of data for 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa from 2005 to 2015. These are geocoded individual data and we combine them with information on where are local mineral resources and the historical boundaries of ethnic homelands. This allows us to compare in a given region and month individuals who live in this same region but belong to different ethnic groups, and that have, whereas different ethnic groups differ in the amount of mineral resources produced in their historical homeland. In this setting, we find that ethnic group identity becomes more salient when minerals exploitation in the group's historical homeland intensifies. We show that the effect appears after production start and is persistent, and it's magnified during election periods. And we have different results which are consistent with the exclusion deprivation channel that I will describe later in the presentation. So to go a bit more into the details of the data that we're using is data from the Afrobarometer survey, which has this very interesting question of, let us suppose that you had to choose between being a national, say, a Burkinabe in Burkina Faso, and being a Mossi, you are Mossi in Burkina Faso. Which of the following best expresses your feelings? And the main outcome variable is a category called variable, ranging from I feel only a member of the Mossi, or I feel only a Burkina member of a national state of Burkina Faso. Alternatively, we can also consider a dummy, which is equal to 1 if the respondents feel at least or more toward this ethnic group than to its national state. We then cross information from the Afrobarometer on what is the respondent ethnic group identity reported by respondent with the historical boundaries from the Murdoch Atlas. And we use different potential matching techniques and information on the time and place of mineral resources exploitation, so that the final data structure visually would look like this. So what you have here are different historical ethnic homelands from the Murdoch Atlas, and we represent for each homeland the share of respondents who belong to the ethnic group of that ethnic homeland, no matter whether they live in there or not, and that declares that the ethnic identity matters to them as much, if not more, than their national identity. And you can see a large variation in time and in space of these declarations. To assess causally what is happening, we turn to the following equation. So what we look at is the salience of the ethnic identity of individual I from ethnic group E in region J of country C at time T. And we relate this to the number of mines that are being exploited in that ethnic homelands at time T. We include a wide array of controls and fixed effects, in particular, quite tight level of fixed effect at the region, time year, time month level. This allows us to partial out any local time varying shock or aggregated time varying shock actually, but that includes any economic, political, climatic shock, also any pollution effects from the mine's activity. We also include ethnic group time country fixed effects to account for any ethnic group specificity, that would be the group size, historical ethnic tension, or political power. To make this maybe a bit more intuitive, because we had to discuss among ourselves a bit what were we picking up with this identification strategy. Let's consider two historical ethnic homelands, that of the Tlokwa and of the Venda, and two individuals, one Tlokwa and one Venda, that lives outside of this ethnic homeland for simplicity of the exposure here. Our research question and what our identification strategy allows us to tell is what happens to the salience of the ethnic group identity of this Tlokwa individual and of this Venda individual when a mine opens in the historical homeland of the Tlokwa individual. Importantly is really the fact that this mine opens in the historical homeland. So there's this notion of identity proximity. If the mines open next to the two individuals, but in the homeland of none of them, we expect that any spillover effect of the mine, be it in terms of economic spillover, pollution spillover, whatever, is going to be the same on both individuals. So we will not pick any difference. So what is really key is the idea that the mine opens in the homeland of the Tlokwa individual. Okay. If we turn to the estimation of this equation, we obtain the following result, where we express the salience of ethnic group identification either as a category of variable or dummy, and we can consider is the full sample or only the sample of individuals who live outside of their homeland of origin to mirror this visual set. Okay, and what do we observe is that the number of minds being active in a given ethnic homeland do increase the salience of ethnic identification for members of that ethnic group. And this is true in any of the specification, including of individuals who do not live in their ethnic homeland of origin. The effect appears to be quite persistent of time, but only kicks in at the moment when the mine opens. If you look a year before the mine is opening, so it's already clear that the mine is going to open because an industrial mine takes at least 1, if not 2 years to be built, we observe no such effect, okay? We really observe it only if the mine, yes, so sorry, this is representing the net change in the number of mines in a given individual's ethnic homeland by year and by distance to the year of the survey. And we can see that really the effect appears at the moment of after the mine has opened, and it, if anything, increases with the age of the mine. If it's like has opened 3 years ago, it has a larger effect than if it has opened a year ago. We also find that ethnic identification appears to be stronger during electoral periods and is independently of the country where the natural resources lie. We then turn to what is a potential mechanism behind this effect, and really the way we interpret it is really in terms of resource-induced grievances. Why do we say that? Well, because it seems that resource exploitation may increase the mismatch between aspirations and reality. There's quite a bit of literature in that direction. And if this was the case in our setting, well, we would expect that individual would report more feeling of deprivation independently of the mind's reality. And this is something that we're actually able to test in large part thanks to the data present in the Afrobarometer. So we can show that the presence of minds in one's ethnic homeland also increases the reported lack of welfare-related item. Households report having lacked income, food, fuel, medicines. We can show that it also increases the economic pessimism about the households or the country's economic conditions, saying how you think your household is doing compared to a year ago. This becomes worse at the moment when you have exploitation of mineral resources in the respondents' ethnic homelands. And this is all the most striking results that we do not observe any significant change in terms of asset ownership. We do a household asset index. There's no proper information about income in the Afrobarometer, but we can at least proxy it with this. And if any, the change would be positive. So this pessimism, this lack of welfare-related items seems to be unrelated to the actual change in terms of household wealth. And what we observe is that there may be a group for, there may be a room for group leaders in this, like at least for group level factors, and qualitative literature really insists that it might be the case that group leaders exacerbate this. What we can show here is that indeed group level conditions do shape the relation. So the effects that we observe are clearly magnified for poorer groups that are, or groups that are politically excluded or that have a history of violent conflict. In contrast, the results are really quite inconsistent with the alternative story that would be a story of resources increasing the payoff and the pride from legal lending to a given ethnic group. Say you were beggar and now you became rich. Well, if so, we would observe an improvement in group economic conditions and pride. And as mentioned earlier, we do not observe any significant change, even if anything, it would be positive. It happens to be insignificant. And most importantly, the individuals are more pessimistic. We can also try to go a bit further and look at what is happening locally around the mines. Maybe our baseline specifications here are too broad, and we need to just look at the local effect. And if we zoom in the local effect, say within the 50 kilometers around the mine or 150 kilometers around the mine, we again do not observe a significant economic spillovers on members of the ethnic group, which is supposed to be resource rich. So That's why we push so much the interpretation in terms of resources-induced events. Okay, so yes, that's just showing one of these results. So to conclude, what we find is that the exploitation of mineral resources in an ethnic homeland appears to increase the salience of that ethnic group identity. The effect appears after production starts and is persistent in the following years. This effect is magnified in the vicinity of elections, so it has the likelihood that it persists even further and translates into political outcomes potentially, and is independent of the country of the resource. Results on the mechanism side support the idea that the main result goes through an exclusion deprivation channel as the feelings of economic deprivation and political exclusion associated with natural resources appear to be independent of real economic spillovers. Let me stop here, and many thanks for your attention. Looking forward to all your questions. And I guess we can move towards a discussion. Maybe we can try to start in order. I believe there were a couple of questions that were either to Maha or to all presenters.
Yes, yes, Victor, thanks. Do I read the question? So this is a question from Maria Annie Adriana. So thank you very much for this question. As said that lower expenditure of formal and informal households during extreme rainfall from 16.2% and 10.6% respectively. Can you observe whether the expenditure getting lower due to activities they can perform during the rainfall? In the Philippines, there are two climate characteristics, the wet and dry season. However, our data is annually, so for 1 year. Thus, we cannot observe those activities that are done or they are not able to do when there is during rainfall. However, we have this data. Let me just share it quickly. Also from the FIES, I wasn't able to share this earlier. We also differentiate according to sources of income, non-agriculture and agriculture, and according to type of expenditure. Here, we note that except for agriculture income, the informal households have higher income than the households in the formal sector. So we know that this is expected since agriculture is dependent on rainfall and a substantial proportion of the informal households are engaged in agriculture. But other than this one, we cannot identify the activities that are being done during rainfall days. Thanks, Maria.
If I may follow up, Maha, I had the question just also on your work. I was wondering, like, I do believe extreme rainfall events are very important. How do they relate to other type of extreme events? And I'm thinking in particular about winds or typhoon. Is it something that can be an issue? And does it come correlated with the rainfall? How does the two relate?
Yes, okay. So actually, let me share that screen, okay? Hold on. Let me find it, okay. Okay. So I was working with climate scientists. So actually we had this is an eye opener. In the beginning, we said, just give us the data and we will just, so normally in the literature, you take the extreme rainfall to be a weather shock and you just take the tail of a normal distribution. So when we showed this to the climate scientists, they said, that cannot be an extreme rainfall or a shock. So that's why we had to define it like this. But we note that because of, so this is already the greater than the 95th percentile of the daily rainfall across 2 decades. But nonetheless, this one, there are like monsoon rains or we have typhoons that doesn't have rain. So that this measure does not include those typhoons that doesn't have rain, but it can include like the prolonged monsoon rains. Okay, so we don't have the typhoon, but it really create a, it was really a disaster, especially when it happens in Manila where you have a very densely populated area. So that's the thing that this measure cannot capture. So it's a different measure when you say typhoon, because typhoon is with regarding to the wind speed. Thanks, Victor.
And should we move maybe to the question that was directed to Soraya before there is a more general question that we can discuss at the end? I believe so. There was at least one question from what I'm seeing here, asking that the incentive on renewable energy has been reducing by almost 12%, but not necessarily decreasing the use of fossil fuel. Would the government foresee to add fossil fuel tax while giving more subsidy in renewable energy to support the shifting to renewable energy?
Right,
and there's
thank you.
Second question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you can go ahead.
No, go ahead. Maybe
okay.
It's easier clearer to answer one by one.
Thank you, Maria Eni. Thank you for your question. I think my understanding of the first question is you're trying to understand why the policy leads to a reduction in renewable energy price by up to 12%, but there's not necessarily a decrease in the use of fossil fuel. And probably you're asking a follow-up question that would the government propose to add a fossil fuel tax in addition to the subsidy? Well, I think if you look at the result I presented, I think one of the things we found is that the prices of renewable energy reduces because, of course, subsidy will definitely reduce the cost of production, right? But we found out that instead of renewable energy serving as a kind of like substitution for fossil fuel, we see that as renewable energy is as the use of renewable energy is increasing, fossil fuel is supposed to reduce. But in that case, we also find that in some sectors, fossil fuel also increases, right? So that substitution effect that we are expecting, particularly in terms of climate change mitigation, is not there. So that could be attributed to the fact that, of course, the economy is expanding. As a result of the economy expanding, there might also be need for more energy consumption. And the increase in renewable energy that we observed might not be enough to compensate for that increase in demand for overall energy. That is one. Then secondly, in terms of whether the government could impose fossil fuel tax, well, practically that might be possible, but in terms of politically, that might not be very feasible, because I think in Nigeria, fossil fuel is subsidized, and removing the subsidy itself has always been a challenge. There have been a lot of political protests. There have been political protests. There have been opposition. So I do not foresee. Of course, that might make some very good public policy or economic policy, but politically or realistically, I don't see the government doing that, imposing tax on fossil fuel. I think politically, I'm not sure there's any Nigerian government that wants to do that at the moment. So I think the other question you asked is, does the research, does it lead to a reduction in CO2 emission? Yes, I think one of the results I presented shows that when the subsidy is financed, by fiscal deficit, it leads to a reduction in CO2 emission by 4%. But when it is financed by adjusting government expenditure, the emission reduces by 7.3%. But the challenge there is we may not necessarily look at the second scenario and think that is better because the emission reduction is higher. Because if you look at some of the other results I presented, we saw that the second scenario leads to reduction in household welfare, reduction in economic growth, right? So of course, if economic growth reduces, if household consumption and welfare reduces, you can expect that emission will reduce. But in terms of climate change mitigation, I don't think that's the kind of emission reduction we are looking at. We don't want to reduce CO2 emission at the expense of economic growth or at the expense of household welfare, right? I think the idea of climate change mitigation is as much as possible that we want to address these environmental issues. We also want to try to balance them with economic growth, with welfare. So I think the research reported the impact on CO2 emission, and the idea is just that when the subsidy is financed by deficit, I think the CO2 emission reduces, but not that much. Thank you for your question, Marianne.
thank you for the question and answer. So yeah, there was also a question from Ilya Drayana on the case of my presentation, asking about the correlation of my research, the corruption level and the Gini ratio in these countries. We do not observe how this corruption level or Gini answer to the presence of the mines, but this has been done in other works. What we can look at in our case is whether this level of corruption or inequalities can be a mediating factor or increase, maybe magnifies the effect that we observe. And it is not the case in the case of the corruption. Is something that we have tried indeed to split the sample, say, by whether the country has a higher or lower level of corruption, and we do not observe any such heterogeneity. In terms of the Gini, we do not try directly to Gini, but it's a bit the idea behind looking if there's a heterogeneity by the group being initially poorer than the average group in the country. And we do observe here that this really magnifies the effect indeed. So thanks a lot for your question. I think it's really interesting. And this, maybe we have time for closing the discussion with a more general question by Farida Nur Aziza, which was a question for all of the three of us, but I have the feeling that Maha and Sola are going to be so much more experts to answer on it than I am, but we can still discuss it all together, which has to say amazing presentation from all presenters. I would like to ask all presenters if they have any indexes that can reflect environmental problem per capita, and whether such environmental indexes should be indicated and should be included as indicators of poverty as well.
Maya, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure what environmental index Farida is referring to, but there is one like the Green Net National Product, which takes into account the depreciation of natural capital to be included as a measure of welfare. So that may be one. Maybe Sola can add additional.
Yeah, I think what came to my mind is from my understanding, I think so far most research use greenhouse gas emission per capita. I think that is more or less what is commonly used in the literature. And I think the other part of the question also said, do you think environmental index should be included as indicator of poverty as well? I think yes, that is extremely important, because in the context of the Global Agenda 2030, I think we are not only focusing on poverty reduction, we're also looking at sustainable poverty reduction, sustainable development, looking at how poverty reduction impacts environmental quality and how environmental quality also affects poverty reduction. So I think it's extremely important that environmental index or indicators are included in the measurement of poverty.
I guess I agree with Sola on the notion that indeed this notion of environmental poverty or quality is a really important part of poverty, in the sense that living in a polluted environment will have very bad in the medium run health consequences, right? So I feel like if it would be maybe a more complete version of the Human Development Index that had been developed by Amartya Sen, where you have this notion of education, income poverty, and health. And if you have environmental issue in time T where you live, you will face this in terms of health in the longer run. So maybe that might be a way to include it. The operationalization of this demands work. That's a full research agenda that you're opening.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's
I guess
all, right?
Do you have? Do you want to say a few closing words, Maha and Sola, before we close the section? I believe we have 1 minute left before it ends.
Yeah, let me quickly just want to thank everyone for attending this session. I think we really appreciate your questions and your comments, and it's a pleasure presenting this work and meeting all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure to meet you and discuss with you today.
Yeah,
Have
hope
a
to see
great
you
day.
all in person.
Yes, fingers crossed the next time is in person. It would be much
Yeah.
even nicer.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, bye.
Have a great day or evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.